Now, Ankara has been fence-sitting when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia crisis, because the Turkish President Erdogan has to pursue a delicate balancing act between the two parties. On the one hand, Turkey has very deep relations in energy, tourism, trade, and defense with Russia. And on the other hand, Turkey has a deepening defense partnership with Ukraine. And as Erdogan said, Turkey neither wants to give up its relations with Russia nor with Ukraine. Now, when it comes to Turkey's assistance to Ukraine, there are two sides to this story. On the one hand, since 2019, one of the Turkish private defense firms, namely Bayraktar, which belongs to Erdogan's son-in-law, has signed multiple agreements with Ukraine to export armed drones. And until now, between a dozen and 20 armed drones have reportedly been sold by Bayraktar Defense Company to Ukraine. And we have already seen some footage of these armed drones in service against Russian forces. And Ukraine actually thanked Turkey for them. Now, the other side of the story is that since the beginning of the Russian invasion, Turkey has continued its balancing act and hasn't chosen clear sides. Yes, at the rhetorical level, Turkey opposes Russian attack against Ukraine. And but when it comes to taking concrete action, we haven't seen real moves by Ankara. And to give you a couple of examples, Turkey hasn't joined its NATO allies in any of the sanctions. And in fact, Ankara remains opposed to sanctioning Russia. When the Council of Europe voted to suspend Russia, Turkey was one of the 5 countries that did not vote to suspend Russia. And the Turkish airspace remains open, one of the last remaining airspaces open to Russia within NATO. Now, the rhetoric coming from Washington, from Brussels, and also from Kiev aims at moving Turkey from Russia toward the transatlantic alliance, toward greater solidarity with Ukraine. So I understand that they are generous with their praise, even when there is not much Turkey can offer. So this is mostly an investment, a hope that Ankara will be more helpful when it comes to the crisis. But at the same time, there are facts on the ground that Turkey did not vote against Russia in the Council of Europe. Turkey has not initiated any sanctions. Turkey keeps the airspace open. And more interestingly, on February 28th, Turkey announced under the Montreux Convention of 1936 that it will close the Turkish Straits to warships from all countries. And minutes later, there was a call between the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu. And in the US readout of the call, we see that Blinken thanks Çavuşoğlu for Turkey's steps under the Montreux Convention. But when we take a look at what Turkey did, that is restricted access to all warships and not just the belligerent warships, namely the warring parties, namely Russia and Ukraine. This also shows that Ankara is still providing concessions to Russia, because under Article 19 of the Montreux Convention, Turkey could have simply restricted access to the warring parties, namely Ukraine and Russia. And even then, these both countries can still transit their vessels back to their home ports in the Black Sea. But by blocking all warships from all countries, technically, the Erdogan government has blocked all NATO warships, with the exception of the Black Sea parties, namely Bulgaria and Romania, from entering the Black Sea. And this I would see again as a concession to Russia. But nevertheless, Secretary of State Antony Blinken thanked Erdogan for this move. I think we will continue to see a balancing act from Turkey. Rhetorically, we see greater and greater Turkish commitment to Ukraine and NATO. But when it comes to action, we shouldn't expect much from Ankara. And the key issue here is that Putin has enormous leverage over Erdogan. Turkey is heavily dependent on Russian natural gas. Turkey's tourism sector is heavily dependent on Russian tourists. Turkey's agricultural exporters are dependent on Russian markets. Russia is building Turkey's first ever nuclear reactor, and there are significant revenue guarantees to Russia. And more importantly, Turkey still has the Russian-built S-400 air defense system. And ultimately, Turkey's cross-border military operations in Syria can only be carried out with Russia's blessing, with Russia's permission to use the northern Syrian airspace. So when we put all these together, I think it would not be realistic to expect the Erdogan government to take concrete steps against Russia. Yes, we will see increased rhetorical commitment to Ukraine and Turkey's NATO allies. And, deep down, I'm sure Turkey does not want Russia to win. Turkey does not want Russian hegemony to expand in the Black Sea. But ultimately, Erdogan has very little room for maneuver to push back against that openly. I think Syria will remain at the top of Turkey's decision-making calculus when it comes to the Ukraine war. Because ultimately, for Turkey's national security establishment, regardless of what's happening around the world, the Kurdish issue remains the existential issue. Hence, the Erdogan government would do its best to maintain military access to northern Syria. That is, it would do its best to continue its ongoing security cooperation and coordination with Russia in Syria, because ultimately Moscow can deny Ankara Syrian airspace, and Moscow can also make life very difficult for cross-border Turkish operations. So to this end, I do not expect Ankara to take many risks by taking concrete action against Russia when it comes to Ukraine. And on the Russian side, I think the Kremlin is keenly aware of this delicate balance, and they will continue to leverage their ongoing relationship, their ongoing coordination with Turkey in Syria, hoping that that will be enough deterrence against Ankara's greater partnership with NATO allies in pushing back against Russia in Ukraine and the Black Sea. I think we are already seeing quite radical shifts in European foreign and security policy thinking. To begin with, Germany's decision to earmark $100 billion worth of arms purchases this year, and to increase its military spending to 2% of its GDP. These are landmark moves. Add to that, the European Union's decision, again, to earmark $500 million of weapons purchases to be provided over to Ukraine, again, is the first time in the European history that Brussels is taking such an action. This shows that in the near future, we will see a more muscular European foreign and security policy. I think they will be more interested in pushing back against Russian hegemony, not only financially and diplomatically, but also militarily. Maybe not necessarily directly, but possibly through partners and proxies. This could also bring about greater European Union presence and interest in the Middle East beyond just the refugee crisis. Because so far, the European Union's approach to the Middle East was a limited one, aimed at limiting, restricting refugee flows from the Middle East. So it was basically a domestic policy concern. But I think at this point, with Russian expansionism, with Russian irredentism, the European Union has no choice but to push back against Russian hegemonic ambitions, not just in the Union's eastern borders, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. And this could also mean a greater engagement between the European Union and a number of state and non-state actors in the Middle East and the Gulf. Yes, I also think that there is an ongoing shift within the United States. Until recently, there was almost a non-partisan growing consensus around neo-isolationism, around a reluctance for the United States to engage globally. But I think Russian irredentism, Russian expansionism, has shown to the US public that the history has not ended, that there are still major rivalries shaping today's world and threatening Western security, and that the US cannot really take a backseat, that it has to be involved diplomatically, that it has to be involved alongside its treaty allies militarily, and Ukraine will play that turning point, will play a decisive moment in American history when there will be a rethinking in foreign and security policy, just as we see a similar trend in Germany as well as the rest of the European Union.